Hello and welcome to Whispers Reddit. We're thrilled to have you join our cozy corner where we dive into the most intriguing, heartwarming, and sometimes mysterious stories from Reddit. Whether you're here to unwind, get inspired, or simply enjoy a good story, you've come to the right place. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a whisper. Grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's embark on this storytelling journey together. Thank you for being part of our community. Let's get started. What is the most embarrassing family secret you are aware of? Story 1. I had a great aunt who vanished without a trace in the 1940s or 1950s in the Portland area. She was in her mid-20s, had a good relationship with her family, and was intelligent and content. One day, she just didn't return home from work. Her family was confused, not knowing where she went or why she would leave, so they assumed she had been abducted or had died. 5 years later, her brother is in Chicago for business one day. After leaving his office, he sees her walking down the street. Thinking it must be an accident, he calls her name, but she turns around and sees him. He stops her and asks, "What's going on?" She tries not to answer his questions, but eventually invites him to her apartment, promising to explain everything when they get there. When they get there, her brother starts asking questions right away, so she tells him to wait while she goes to the store across the street to buy some cigarettes because this situation is equally overwhelming for her, but for some reason, her brother lets her go alone. She never comes back, and we still don't know what happened. Story 2. I come from a pretty dysfunctional family, so here are some secrets, and you can choose which is the most unsettling. My Uncle Jeff once got high and killed his best friend, but he only got minor punishment because my grandpa was the police chief. Uncle Jeff also used to harm his daughters for money, and eventually his wife divorced him and took the girls with her. A few years later, both daughters became pregnant with their stepfather, who was ironically a preacher. To protect his reputation, the family claimed that my grandpa had cancer, but I'm still not sure how he got it, so everyone stays away from the subject. The same grandpa also spread untrue rumors about my mom having affairs, which caused tension in her marriage. He persisted in doing this even after my mom suffered as a result of the ensuing conflict. My sister ran away from home once and experienced a traumatic event, but no one took action to help her. Instead, she was blamed for being rebellious, and my family used to joke about it, but now the topic is never discussed. Story 3. Our small three-family house in East Boston was robbed, and the main item taken was my grandmother's priceless jewelry from Italy. Since she didn't want my uncle to marry a certain woman, she reportedly hired some people to threaten and intimidate the woman in the hopes that she would stay away. I was probably young when this happened. When I was 10 years old, I watched my Italian grandfather speak to the police. He politely declined their offers of assistance and then made a few phone calls. Shortly after they left, the phone rang, and my grandfather answered in Italian that I couldn't understand. He then kissed my grandmother and left the room. I remember one phrase he said before hanging up, which sounded like blow calipore, and I made fun of it until I realized it was a new phrase I had never heard before. I asked my grandmother what it meant, and she told me to lock the door. Years later, my mother gave me the background of the story. My grandfather's friend had called to tell him that two men were attempting to sell my grandmother's jewelry at a nearby Italian cafe. My grandfather's final words to the men on the phone were a heavily accented version of Blair Leora, which means lock the door. I'm not sure what transpired next, but about 15 minutes later, my grandfather returned with all the missing jewels. Story 4. My uncle is my biological father returned from Vietnam in 1969, and I don't know where he was or what he saw, but it wasn't easy for a young man from northern Minnesota. He struggled with substance abuse, including heroin and alcohol, after returning, and he met my mother. Amid a whirlwind of addiction, they got married soon after my mother became pregnant. From what I understand, my mother wasn't a heavy drug user until she tragically met my father. My aunt is my adoptive mother. When I was about 10 months old, they got into a heated argument in the garage, and my father threw me to the ground, seriously injuring me. My mother retaliated by hitting him with an object, and my father then pulled out a weapon, hurting both of us. I almost died that day, and I spent the majority of the next year in the hospital. The doctors were worried about long-term effects, but I recovered better than they had anticipated, though I still get headaches from the incident occasionally. Was lucky enough to be adopted by my uncle and aunt, who I think of as my real parents, and they gave me a loving home. Story 5. When I was 21, almost 24 years old, my oldest sister told me that she had been raped by a stranger when she was 17. I was shocked because no one in my large family had ever brought it up before. My sister is 17 years older than me, and we look a lot alike. I once asked my mother specific questions about my birth for a class project, but she was unable to remember things like who was present or what time I was born. It seems like something they might have done given the circumstances, but I never asked my sister directly because it doesn't quite make sense that she would share such a personal story without mentioning this possibility. My parents are also very religious and strongly oppose abortion. Over time, I started to suspect that I might actually be my sister's daughter as a result of that tragic event, and that my grandparents have been raising me as their own child all these years. I also don't want to risk. I suppose my childhood is a family secret because everyone knows my grandma as my mother, but I was actually adopted. My biological mother married a man who mistreated me throughout my early childhood until I was around 5 or 6 years old. I told a friend, who told her parents, who then told the school. Rather than confronting her husband, with whom she had 2 other children, my biological mother told the police that I was lying, and I was. Our family moved across the state after I was placed in foster care, which allowed my stepdad to avoid charges. She even put a restraining order on me until I turned 18. I remember getting into trouble at school once, and when the staff wanted to call my parent, I asked them to call my grandma. However, grandma wasn't listed on the file, only mom was. It was awkward to be asked by the vice principal why I didn't always call my grandma mom. It's just something you don't normally share. I apologize if I'm rambling, but this is a throwaway account in case anyone is looking at my main account's Possiest History Story 7. According to family lore, my great-grandmother Gigi was a black widow who had 4 husbands who all died mysteriously. One of her husbands was stabbed by Gigi's brother, who allegedly defended Gigi from his attack. No charges were ever filed against them. In 1950, when Gigi was 18, her daughter stopped talking to her. I became quite close to Gigi during the last 10 years of her life, and she seemed like the sweetest, most normal grandmother you could imagine most of the time, but occasionally when something made her angry, she would get this unsettling look. Gigi passed away in 2014 at the age of 96, which is a long time to not speak to your own mother, so something serious must have happened. The rumor is that my grandma thought Gigi killed her father and got away with it. Story 8. I recently lost a cousin who battled homelessness, addiction, and alcoholism. As he was nearing the end of his life, he expressed a wish to learn more about his father. My aunt left him when my cousin was just 2 years old because his father had been abusive and had caused serious harm. They had 4 children together, but none of them had heard anything about their father for 40 years, and the 3 surviving children showed no interest in learning about him or his fate. I looked online and discovered that their father had died around 10 years ago. He had another family, which my cousins don't know anything about, but this second family is wealthy while my cousins are impoverished. One of his daughters from the second family lives in our community, and based on her social media posts, it appears that she goes to the same church as one of my surviving cousins. It's possible that they know each other, but they wouldn't be aware of their shared connection, so I've chosen not to tell them until I see that they're. Even though Story 9 isn't really a family secret, there is a suspicion that my grandpa may have been involved in something serious. He is a difficult person who gets angry easily and was known to be abusive to his wives and kids. My mom still bears the scars from his actions decades later. At one point, my grandpa got into a fight with someone, possibly a local police officer or someone else, and weeks later, this person was discovered dead near train tracks. Years later, my grandpa told my mom something, saying something like, "If you ever have problems with someone, I know how to handle it." He also showed signs of troubling behavior, such as cruelty toward animals. Story 10. My grandpa has a son from a different woman who is the same age as my uncle. The woman named her son after my grandpa as well. In this way, technically I have 2 Uncle Roberts. My mom's side of the family doesn't talk about him. I only found out when my mom mentioned that he had recently graduated from prison and was attempting to. Despite the family history, I don't think many of my cousins are aware of this, with the possible exception of my uncle's children. My grandfather and uncle have a very tense relationship, and I can imagine that my uncle may have told his children about it in an attempt to turn them against my grandpa. My grandparents have been married for 60 years, and I'm not sure how my grandma handled everything at the time, but she did, and I believe that's amazing. Story 11. My mom always claimed she was arrested because my dad smoked a. My brother and I lived with my dad's adoptive parents for 5 years while our biological parents were incarcerated. I never really thought about who my real parents were because I was raised with my grandparents until I was around 5 years old, and I thought they were my parents. Recently, they returned a number of my childhood possessions, including some court documents, and it turned out that we were taken from my mom's custody due to child neglect. The house was. My mom didn't show up when she was finally allowed to spend a few days with us under supervision. Instead, she would drive around aimlessly for hours for reasons I don't understand. The place was described as borderline unsanitary. There was marijuana in the refrigerator but not much food, and both my brother and I had multiple bruises. I also had a broken rib, and my brother needed treatment for a fractured skull. Eventually, we were returned to her custody, and she had a new boyfriend who mistreated us as well. My mom will never tell anyone the truth because she always presents herself as the victim, the strong single mother trying her hardest. This is classic narcissistic behavior. My mother and I are convinced that my grandfather may have fathered a child because she treated our brother like a child, even though he was growing up. He believes everything she says and resents our grandparents for trying to make sure he received proper care, like speech therapy and close supervision at school. We learned that he had a serious relationship with his girlfriend while stationed in Europe during World War II. He rarely talked about his time in the war, but we knew that they were in love while he was there. He was supposed to bring her to the US when he returned, but he never did, which was disappointing because we assumed that this was a fairly common occurrence at the time. After he passed away, we went through his belongings and discovered a photo of a woman who, according to his note on the back, was his girlfriend in the Story 13. When I was a child, we had to spread salt all over our floors or we'd wake up every morning to find them covered in slugs, not just a few, but enough to make it look like we had a slimy black carpet. She is smiling and pointing at what appears to be a noticeable pregnancy bump. We're not positive, but we're fairly certain she was pregnant when the photo was taken. It makes me wonder why my grandfather never sent for her. If I have unknown cousins somewhere in Europe at the moment. Initially disgusted, I discovered that they were actually helpful. You could rub their secretions on cuts or scrapes to speed up healing or squeeze them to relieve dry eyes. Their mucus contains a strange-tasting chemical that helps. If someone in the family had diaper rash, we would even put a few slugs in the diaper, and it seemed to work wonders. We initially believed the slugs were getting into the house through the bathtub faucet, but it turned out that my eccentric grandma was stealing them from our neighbor's slug farm in 1997. I know a messed up secret about my friend's family because of Story 14. His mother worked in the adult film industry in the 1970s and 1980s before leaving that life to marry his father. When the internet became more widely available in the mid-1990s, my friend, like many teenagers, began exploring it. Before you draw conclusions, though, this story takes a different turn because he didn't just happen to stumble upon pictures of his mother without realizing it. Instead, he told me about it. That after hearing his father's rumors, he purposefully looked for them out of curiosity. After discovering the pictures, he realized he was attracted to them and acted on those feelings. I was shocked to hear this, and it temporarily altered my opinion of him, but he later showed me one of her old films, grainy and unmistakably from a different era, which, from the standpoint of a teenager, was more exposure than we were used to at the time. Surprisingly, I could understand why he felt that way, even though it was a strange Story 15 about my grandfather cheating on my. I'm 29 years old, and the only people I know about it are my grandmother and my oldest uncle. It has been a family secret for decades. I learned about it when I was living with my grandparents for a few years to help them out. One day, while I was helping him, my grandfather asked for help setting up online banking. He wanted to set up automatic payments, which I assumed were for bills. As I was helping him, he mentioned sending payments to Julia, which I assumed meant a company. When I asked me what the, I was shocked when he said, to get back at your nana, and we ended up talking about it for 2 hours. He explained that my grandmother had cheated on him, so he sought revenge by having an affair. I found out that I have a half-uncle my age. I've tried to get more information from my grandfather and uncle, but they won't share anything more. I think it would be interesting to meet an uncle my age. Story 16. My aunt had a baby when she was a teenager, and my uncle assisted her in delivering it at home. He left the room. He hurried back to get something to cut the umbilical cord and tie it off, but he panicked when he heard the baby stop crying. The baby appeared healthy at first, so he was shocked and furious when he asked my aunt what had happened. She casually said that the baby had simply stopped breathing, and later she admitted to smothering it. My mother was about 8 or 9 years old at the time, and she was very perplexed by what had happened. It wasn't until later that she pieced the story together. Talking to my uncle, my mother claims that my grandfather was furious and almost beat my aunt before going outside and burying the child in the backyard. My grandfather was a World War II veteran who had witnessed a lot, but my mother claims that he sobbed the whole time he dug the grave. It turns out that my aunt had other pregnancies when she was a teenager, with one baby stillborn and another not surviving for other reasons. My aunt passed away, and it's ironic that she was a cruel person. Preacher Story 17. As I grew older, I started talking to her more because I thought I could relate to her in some way. It turned out that she was actually my sister. Growing up, there was this woman who would occasionally show up at family get-togethers. She was thought to be the troublesome child of an old family friend who had died. She frequently came around requesting money or a place to stay. The family said she had fallen into a bad lifestyle involving drugs and other issues, so most of the family avoided her. 18. My parents recently shared some details about what my grandfather did to my grandmother in the late 1930s. I knew my mother had an older sister who was stillborn, but I never understood why that happened. My religious mother had her when she was a teenager, and my grandparents did everything in their power to keep the situation a secret from the community. This revelation was one of the many reasons I eventually left my hometown and developed a strong dislike for religious communities that prioritize reputation over family story. In an era when home births were common and phones were not available in rural areas, my grandfather didn't want the baby, so when my grandmother went into labor, he disappeared instead of bringing the doctor as promised, leaving her to give birth alone at home miles from any help. He returned with the doctor more than 24 hours later, but by then it was too late. The baby had died and my grandmother was in critical condition. Despite this, they stayed together, though I can't understand why. In order to prevent a similar situation, my grandmother made sure she was nearby to assist her in walking herself to the doctor's office. In addition, my grandfather revealed a mysterious secret to my father on his deathbed about something he did during World War II, but my father won't tell anyone about it because he has openly talked about his own experiences during the Vietnam War. This secret must be extremely upsetting. Story 19. My cousin battled heroin addiction while living at her parents' house once. Without doing much research, they found out she was addicted and sent her to a treatment center. After dropping her off the treatment group, they took her to a large city and began attempting to change her beliefs. They made her hold an electrode in each hand and asked her to confess her transgressions before demanding $500. For some reason, my cousin eventually called her parents, upset that they had accidentally sent her to this group. Her parents were shocked because they were unaware of it, so they hurried to. When my grandfather returned from the hospital, I stayed with him for a few days to take care of his house after his unsuccessful attempt to harm himself. I went to give him a hug, but he grabbed me inappropriately, which was shocking and upsetting. I told him right away that we couldn't do that, and he replied that we weren't biologically related, which was unsettling. This man had been my grandfather my entire life, so it hurt me. About a week later, while I was washing dishes, my grandfather touched me inappropriately again, and I hit him with a spatula I was holding, causing him to fall. I helped him to his recliner and left soon after, neither of us discussing the incident with anyone else, and I haven't been back since story 21. I told my father about it in great detail, but he insisted that my grandfather was mentally ill and probably delusional. My grandfather on my mother's side was reportedly battling leukemia when I was very young. I recall my mother flying to Iowa a few times to visit him before he passed away, and I assumed it was because of leukemia. Fast forward to about 18 years later, and my brother asks me how I think Grandpa died. I tell him it was leukemia, and he says that's what I thought too, but our older brother claims that he killed himself because it seems my mother didn't want us to know the truth. I've tried looking through Iowa death records because I know the county he lived in, but I haven't found anything conclusive. I'd like to know the truth, but I doubt I'll ever be able to ask my mom about it because story 22 is a strange story. His life with a gun was the reason my mom first flew to Iowa, because she was worried about his mental state because of his depression. I don't have the courage to ask my mom directly because I don't want to make her relive that painful memory, whether it's true or not. When the day's activities are over, the uncles gather outside out of sight while the aunts wash dishes and the cousins play. The uncles sit under the trees leaning back in their chairs, drinking and laughing, and one uncle makes the sound show rook. Even though it's dark, you can imagine him making a hand gesture moving sideways in front of his mouth. This is a joke that my uncles only tell when they've had a little too much to drink. It's a sort of family tradition passed down from one generation to the next. When asked what it means, the uncles always say they'll tell us when you're older. It's a story they promise to share later, keeping it mysterious and secret. On the summer I turned 18, I finally heard the full story. The aunts smile and shake their heads at the noise men. The cousins mimic the sound by running around and laughing. The uncles lean down and teach the younger ones to make the sound and gesture. They were all in the same regiment, captured, and made to work in a labor camp every day, fearing for their lives under the watchful eyes of a vicious officer. The officer had a cruel routine. If he found a woman he wanted, he would put her in a humiliating situation before killing her. The sound Shah Rukh was the noise made when the officer committed the horrible act, but one day while trying to do so, he hurt himself, killing himself. The uncles always thought that. Story 23. When I was 17, my father broke down and told me the hard truth that he had another child born 16 months before me with a woman who wasn't my mother. This occurred during a brief separation between my parents, and everyone in the family knew except for me that my half-brother was raised entirely on my own. That sound is now the family secret code for hope. It symbolizes unexpected survival, a terrible act that somehow led to their escape from a grim fate. His mother and father didn't meet him until he was 13 years old, all the while leading what seemed to be a normal life with my mom and me. My mom even knew he existed. My parents had agreed that they could maintain their marriage as long as my dad didn't have any contact with his other child, so whenever we went to see my grandparents, they would conceal pictures of my half-brother to prevent me from learning about it. I've always felt a little guilty about being the child my father chose to raise, but fortunately my half-brother and I have developed a close relationship with him, and my father has been trying to strengthen our relationship over the past few years. Story 24. I have a great uncle who is, to put it plainly, a horrible person. He preaches for a church, but I'm not even sure which denomination it is affiliated with, and I doubt he adheres to any true religious doctrine. He's the biggest hypocrite I know. He acts self-righteous and condemns other religions, and he won't let anyone into his church unless they are making a financial contribution. The majority of my family is Roman Catholic, and he once told one of my. He even claimed that he would be up in the castle, higher up in heaven than everyone else, regardless of anyone's beliefs. That is just wrong. He also insulted my grandfather, his brother-in-law, for asking to pray before having surgery for an aneurysm. You would think that a preacher would offer consolation, but apparently not. To make matters worse, my great-uncle used to sell narcotics, serious drugs, and he forced his nieces and nephews to deliver them. His son also assaulted one of my aunts, and to make matters worse, he molested at least 2 of my aunts when they were young. They only came forward about it recently because they felt guilty for a long time. Despite all of this, my family has continued to interact with him for years to avoid causing a rift. Most of the family members were aware of the drug dealing, even if they were unaware that he was involving the children. The real breaking point, however, was when he began disparaging my. He always gave me the creeps as a child. Story 25. About 3 years ago, my mother tried to hurt my daughter by depriving her of water while we were at a family picnic. My mother gave my son food and water when he asked, but my nonverbal 2-year-old daughter received nothing. It took us some time to realize what was happening, and it was actually my 5-year-old son who pointed it out. My grandparents learned about their religion at that point, and they finally severed their relationship with him. Telling a toddler that she wasn't entitled to water when I confronted my mother, who told my wife and I that my daughter didn't deserve it because she wasn't the firstborn. I was furious and prepared to confront her physically, but my dad was there and verbally defended her. By the time we stepped in, my daughter was so dehydrated that we had to give her fluids, which was traumatic for a 2-year-old. Since then, we've only spoken to my parents twice, at my grandparents' funerals, and neither of them have seen our parents. Story 26. My mother's biological father married my grandmother while he was stationed in Chicago. When they learned she was pregnant, he left and returned home. My mother tried to visit our home after that incident, but I told her that if she ever tried to contact my kids again, I would call the police and defend my family if necessary. It may sound dramatic, but I mean it. My kids will decide how they feel about their grandparents when they are old enough. Given the limited information he had given her, my grandmother was able to determine his residence and took a train to confront him. This occurred in the 1940s, and when she got there, his sisters met her, explained that he was already married and had children, and gave her about $800, a substantial sum at the time, with the advice that she take care of it and get an abortion. My grandmother was devastated, but she chose to use the money to return to Chicago and start a new life for herself and my mother. My mother passed away a few years ago, and I registered for a genetic testing website after I had a cancer scare. Someone claimed to be my 3rd cousin, but we didn't know how we were related. After comparing names, we discovered that we were related through my mom's biological father, who was well known in his state and had been the state's attorney general for more than 20 years. If it had been revealed that he had an illegitimate child, it most likely would have been. My dad's side of the family is large because he has or had 7 siblings, so there were many cousins and extended relatives at the funeral. At the time, I was having a fairly serious conversation with one of my cousins when a man who looked like he was in his 50s approached me and started talking. He gave off a very creepy vibe, so I responded briefly in the hopes of avoiding him as soon as possible. I also noticed that my grandma was ignoring him completely, acting as though he was not there. It turns out that this man is actually the child of my grandmother and my deceased aunt's husband. My grandmother had an affair with him while my grandpa was in jail, but she refuses to admit that it ever happened, which is why she gave the child up for adoption and won't even look at him. I was not present when he attempted to speak with her. A few days later, I overheard my dad talking to the cousin I had been speaking to at the funeral, and I was able to hear some of their conversation. I don't know if it was the stress of his wife's illness, but my mother's uncle decided that the family needed to join her in heaven, so he shot his 2 younger children while they were sleeping, and my mother's oldest cousin managed to escape through a window after hearing the news. The most tragic events in my family's history occurred when my mother was young and she was visiting her 3 cousins at her aunt's house who was dying of cancer. Fortunately, my grandma declined their invitation to spend the night, and they returned home after dinner. Story 29. I always knew my mother was previously married and divorced, but I never asked for details because she frequently told me that if I ever wanted to know the full story, all I had to do was ask. She ran to a neighbor's house, and they called the police. When the police arrived, my mother's uncle tried to kill himself, but the gun jammed, and he was taken into custody and sent to a mental health facility. I'm not sure what happened to him after the incident. During a visit to my grandmother, uncle, and aunt one evening, my grandmother unintentionally revealed that she couldn't stand my biological father. She mentioned his full name, which had the same last name as my current father's. At first, I thought she was confused because she is 90 years old, but when she repeated it, everyone else seemed perplexed, except for my aunt, who was shocked to learn that my biological father is actually my stepfather's brother, so my mom got married. My aunt has always stood out in our family. She has jet black hair, a darker complexion, and is very thin. Her siblings used to joke that she was adopted or that she was always making mean remarks like kids do, and we were always told that she looked like a distant relative. When she was about 40, my grandfather reconnected with a family after living in Florida for a few years, and that's when the truth came out. My grandparents were once swingers. The big family secret is that my grandfather was quite unfaithful and may have pressured my grandmother into the swinging lifestyle. Story 31. My aunt was the result of my grandmother's affair with another man. This revelation also explained why my grandparents eventually separated. In addition, my grandfather had an affair with his brother's wife, which caused a major fallout. This is why I've never met my great-uncle. Recently began a new job in the local government's climate change department. It was a fantastic opportunity, but my partner wasn't happy about it and started to make things difficult for me. Since he wasn't working, he was supposed to take our son to school, but he frequently didn't bother and wouldn't clean the house. Our relationship had gotten so bad that we hadn't been intimate for months, so resentment isn't exactly a turn-on. One day after I dropped my son off at school, I was running late, so I had to. I took out cash and got a cab at the bank, but then I noticed that something else was wrong. My period was 3 weeks late, so I went to the pharmacy to buy a pregnancy test, fully expecting it to be negative because, well, you have to have sex to get pregnant. To my surprise, both tests came back positive, and I sat there for an hour in shock. When my partner knocked on the bathroom door, I asked him how I could be pregnant, and he admitted to having sex with me while he slept, saying that he had a feeling I would become pregnant as a result of that encounter. I skipped work that day and told my boss about it the following day. He understood that the pregnancy was difficult and that I was not receiving any support because I was already unmarried. I had to quit for obvious reasons, such as low blood pressure, leg swelling and dizziness, but I hadn't been working long enough to be eligible for maternity leave. Despite everything, I tried to ignore my feelings and let my ex have contact with our daughter, staying with him and his mother 3 days a week, assuming she would be safe. He hurt my daughter when she was 3 months old, but he didn't tell me until a few months ago. His family also stopped communicating with him, and as far as I know, he is homeless. My daughter will never understand how she came into the world or why her father isn't in her life. Story 32. My maternal grandmother had a habit of stealing anything she could fit in her purse. It was later explained that this behavior was probably a result of living through the Great Depression. For example, my mom's brother once partially burned down their home to avoid being drafted for the Vietnam War, and he succeeded, but later he was committed to a specialized care facility for schizophrenia, possibly a precursor or cause of her infrequent visits to our home. When she did, my mom would always confiscate her coat and bag. My mom was married twice before she met my father. Her first husband was arrested for smuggling drugs across the border, and she was forced to divorce him. He was sent to jail, and she was placed on probation with orders to stop all contact with him. She left her second husband because he was abusive and only kept her around to care for his children. As a result of his actions, there is also a strong suspicion that my mom and my aunt suffered from schizophrenia, though this is impossible to confirm. Kept in touch with all of her children from her second marriage, she had preserved pictures of their high school and college graduations, and one of her stepsons had even enlisted in the military. We discovered some of these pictures among her possessions, but we didn't know about it until months after her funeral. My mom wasn't tech-savvy and hardly used her phone, and she had concealed our baby pictures because my siblings and I decided to live with our dad following the divorce. I'm not sure if these stories qualify as secrets, but it felt good to share them. Story 33. Growing up, I was never permitted to enter our basement, where my grandpa spent most of his time. I was never given a clear explanation, just that I wasn't supposed to go down there. She claimed that someone had stolen them during a break-in, but we later discovered them buried in her closet. I recently learned that my aunt is doing something similar, keeping childhood photos of herself, my mom, and my uncle along with other family history. As I grew older, I noticed that people were coming and going from the basement late at night, usually older men with strong accents. One night, I was awakened by loud cheering and shouting coming from the basement, which was pretty normal, but it was much louder than usual. I got up to investigate, and I saw at least a dozen men over 60 carrying my grandfather out of the basement, cheering, and smelling of whiskey and cigars. I had never seen him look so happy, so the following morning, I asked my parents about it. My grandpa became ill from asbestos exposure and eventually died after spending his last months in a care facility. Later, I started to hear the basement door softly opening and closing at night, and one night I saw my dad emerge from the basement at 4 a.m. They flatly denied hearing anything during breakfast, but when I insisted that I was positive of what I saw, they changed their story to say that my grandpa had some friends from the bowling club over last night. I assumed he was missing grandpa. When I was 14 years old and homesick from school, I realized one day that I could finally see what was in the basement and that no one could stop me. The first thing I saw was 3 very old blackboards with tables written in chalk. The tables were arranged in rows and columns, listing the names of men and their time scores. I recognized some of the names as neighbors and family. The room was dark and dusty, but it had a bar with stools and an old desk at the end with a computer. That evening, I confronted my father because he took me downstairs, poured himself a drink, and told me all about it. Years before, Grandpa had watched a news segment about violent video games and had become enthralled. He then bought a computer running the popular game Duke Nim and shared it with his friends, who were equally enthralled. They began competing to complete the levels as quickly as possible and even placed bets. The weekly prizes were typically alcohol. This covert competition went on for years without the rest of the family knowing. It's not as shocking as some other stories, but it's unquestionably the most bizarre family secret I know. To this day, my dad and I still play a few levels together over a glass of scotch whenever I visit Story 34, where my mother's first child was given up for an adoption because the father left before the child was born. Eventually, we discovered that everyone thought it was hilarious, based on the old records we found. Many people had participated in this covert competition over the years, with some bets reaching as high as $1,000, and some of the times were quite impressive. She had 2 daughters with her first husband, a gambling addict, after the baby was born. He tragically mistreated the girls for years, and I'm not sure if he left her or not. She then met my father, who was an alcoholic, and left soon after my younger brother was born, claiming that my mother was boring. My mother explained that she had gone to check on him in the restroom at a bar and found him unconscious in the urinal. Neither my sister's father nor my mom used a matchmaking service to find the man who would become my stepfather because he had never paid child support, which likely explains why she felt we needed a man in the house. My stepfather was out of work and illiterate, but we knew he was off and got injections from a nurse every 2 weeks. He smoked 100 cigarettes a day, and I can still clearly remember watching in horror as he strangled my sister until I thought she was dead and she fell limp, not moving for what seemed like. He later had a breakdown and received electroshock therapy, but he returned home and the fighting resumed when I turned 18. My mom finally had enough and left because we lived in government housing and my sisters had already moved out, leaving only my stepfather. I wanted to call the police, but she insisted on keeping him around for childcare while she worked long hours cleaning houses. Eventually he gasped for air, and blood spilled onto the floor. The only good father figure I had, my grandfather, ended up in the hospital right before we had to move. I wanted to visit him, but my stepfather assured me it was nothing serious, so I chose to work my shift that night instead. My brother and I were evicted shortly after because there weren't enough people living in the 3-bedroom house, so before we moved out, I discovered one of my stepfather's medical records that confirmed he had schizophrenia. Although I don't think he hurt her son, my nephew used his lighter on the table to start a fire that destroyed the house. My other sister, the one who was strangled, had 4 children but tragically lost one when she unintentionally suffocated the baby by choking him. My eldest sister had a child whose father had left while she was pregnant. She had become deeply religious and forgave her own father for his past abuse when he needed a place to stay. Story 35. My brother and I have different fathers, but the same mother shot and killed my father when we were very young. She claimed it was SIDS, but she later admitted that she struggled with addiction and that we had to remove her other children from her care. In the meantime, my mom worked as a housekeeper for years, earning money under the table and receiving disability benefits, claiming her wrist never healed after an old injury. When I became an adult, I went through the old high-profile murder case files from the Bay Area in 1976. The case was linked to heavy drug use and involvement with the Hells Angels. I found that my mother had testified against my brother's father to avoid prison time for her own involvement in the incident. Over the years, my mother was evasive about the details, but inconsistencies began to surface, which motivated me to look into the case. I'll never know the full extent of her involvement. It has taken me a long time to accept what little I do know and to forgive her privately. Story 36. My aunt on my father's side lived in the UK in the 1980s and 1990s, when there was little support for Asian victims of violence, and she endured a very abusive marriage. The plea deal allowed her to leave with a completely redacted testimony. I've never confronted my mother about this, primarily because she wasn't a bad parent. He would even beat her at work for minor things like a teacup handle being on the wrong side or just talking to other men. I once saw him threaten my aunt, and when I spoke up, he punched me in the stomach. When my mother found out that I had attempted to protect my aunt and cousins, she took action. My mother, who is half Scottish and half mixed-race Indian with Tamil and East Asian ancestry, went to there. After my mother intervened, some family members continued to make excuses for my father, and my mother called the police, but nothing happened. The situation worsened to the point where my parents sent me to boarding school to protect me from the abuse. House saved my aunt and cousins and drove them to safety in Manchester. I missed a few days of school because of injuries sustained in the assault. We later found out that my father's side of the family had known about the abuse but had done nothing out of fear of the stigma associated with divorce in Indian culture. My aunt's husband eventually left the UK for the USA, which had a devastating effect on my cousins. The older son went on to become a lawyer, while the younger, who had been spoiled by his father's attempts to buy affection, struggled to find his way in life. This experience taught me a lot about how abuse can trick good people into putting up with horrible behavior, and how much awareness and support have changed over the years. Story 37. My mom grew up in a large family in a rough part of the San Francisco Bay Area. When my mom was about 3 years old, she recalled that her older brothers, who were in their 20s, would sneak downstairs and attack her. This continued for years until she was 8 years old, when she confided in her brother. Another brother who wasn't involved overheard and told my grandma. One of the offenders was sent to prison, and another later committed suicide. What's particularly tragic is that my mom's family had a notorious reputation within a 100-meter radius for criminal activity, including carjackings and gang violence. Despite this terrible past, my mom is one of the strongest women I know. She hasn't told many people about her experiences, but I think she should write a book about it because she is one of the kindest and most loving people I've ever met. M frequently closed her eyes during the attacks, making it difficult for her to always recognize who was hurting her. She remembers only 2 of the brothers, specifically when one of them committed suicide, and my grandmother blamed my mom, saying he would still be alive if you hadn't opened your legs. In Story 38, a friend's parents owned a funeral home and had 2 sons. One of the sons was fathered by an employee, making the boys half-brothers, but the owner's son was unaware of this. The owner's son had severe behavioral problems as a child and set the funeral home on fire, killing his parents and thinking he had also killed his half-brother. It's amazing how she managed to graduate from college, raise a family, and keep her kids out of trouble while still having compassion and love for others. Saved his severely burned son from the fire and placed him in a mental hospital for many years. Over the next 20 years, the arsonist carried on the family business as an undertaker, under the guidance of the same employee who had fathered his half-brother. He was unaware of the true nature of their relationship until the half-brother, who was now wearing a mask to hide his scars, was revealed to be alive on national television. This revelation caused a sour dispute between the 2 brothers over the family business. Story 39. The most shocking of the disturbing stories that have recently come to light about the Kennedys is about an incident that occurred during the birth of one of their daughters. According to reports, Mrs. Kennedy was not permitted to push until the obstetrician arrived because he needed to be present to receive payment. The nurse was told to hold the baby's head in place until the doctor arrived, which took several hours. As a result, the baby suffered from severe oxygen deprivation, which caused developmental delays. The family allegedly concealed this incident too. As the daughter grew older, the family started to worry that she might become pregnant. Mr. Kennedy suggested an extreme solution, a lobotomy to remove her sexual impulses without telling the rest of the family. At the time, doctors weren't sure how to perform lobotomies, so the surgeon made multiple incisions in her brain, which eventually caused her to lose her ability to speak. The family was then sent to an institution with the daughter, revealing to others that she had relocated to the Midwest to teach and wanted privacy. Story 40. My family is very honest about a lot of things. They are poor, and thinking back on the past is seen as a way to prevent mistakes from happening again. For instance, my grandfather frequently recounts the tale of a Civil War-era ancestor who killed a man over a pair of boots, forcing him to escape to the plains. This same ancestor once bit off a prostitute's nipple before going insane and, during a bitter Minnesota winter, pointing a rifle at his daughter-in-law. I grew up with my grandmother trying to protect me from my alcoholic father. Her efforts were so intense that they sometimes defied logic. She did the same for other family members, driven by a strong need to protect, and save everyone. Stories like this are common in my family, primarily because the people involved have long since passed away, but what bothers me are the stories about living family members. I only recently learned the reason behind her behavior, her own. For instance, during family reunions, some items are left at home to prevent theft because there are several high-functioning drug addicts in the family, and some items could be stolen and pawned off. How do you even explain that to people given the poverty from which my family comes? There are also quite a few felons among us, but the majority have served their time and now function well in society. Her father was an alcoholic who abused her. Other things are less severe but still unsettling in ways that most people wouldn't understand. Compelled to keep this a secret, which is concerning in and of itself because people tend to treat felons as less than human, and talking about it could result in my exclusion. Story 41. My aunt spent the majority of my life in a relationship that lasted for probably more than 10 years. A few years ago, she and her fiancé ended their engagement, so she decided to try online dating. She met a man online and they started a long-distance relationship while she had a webcam. The man would message her while she was on camera. After watching her go to sleep, she persuaded him to call her, but she was shocked to hear a woman on the other end of the line who claimed that her deceased brother's soul was living inside her body and that he was the person my aunt had fallen in love with. Despite this absurd justification, my aunt drove from Vermont to Arizona to bring the woman back to live with her and her 3 children. As the woman's behavior changed, she started leaving bundles of sage outside my cousin's doors to ward. Eventually, my aunt and the woman entered a civil union. A few months later, the woman tried to kidnap my aunt's youngest son and take him back to a cult in Arizona. Fortunately, she was caught, and my aunt was able to get her son back, but not before draining the bank accounts of both my aunt and my grandparents. The woman had also convinced my aunt to sell most of her belongings and even claimed that spirits had pushed her down the stairs, breaking her arm. It was no secret that my mother was not her favorite child, which made sense in that cultural context. My mother had 2 older brothers and a younger sister, so she was neither a son nor the baby of the family. As a result, my grandmother rarely spoke to her and frequently mistreated her. But in her prime, my grandmother was a member of the Chinese social elite, throwing extravagant parties that were attended by prominent nobility and political figures. One day, my grandmother's best friend pulled my mother aside and revealed a secret that. The claim is supported by additional facts, such as the fact that Chiang Kai-shek was my mother's godfather and that there are pictures and even a magazine cover of her as a baby sitting on his lap. My grandmother never acknowledged that my mother's father was not her first husband as she had claimed, but rather the son of Chiang Kai-shek, the former leader of the Republic of China who later became the president of Taiwan. She passed away recently, taking the secret with her. My father had built a house in Mexico after being deported, and his next-door neighbor was his uncle. I never met this uncle because my father claimed to hate him and described him as an unpleasant person. A few weeks later, I woke up to find my father in an especially pleasant mood. This was my first time seeing him in 10 years. He introduced me to numerous relatives within a few blocks, and I must have met about 50 family members. On my way back to the United States, my paternal grandmother told me that the uncle had mistreated my father when he was younger. Story 43 is not my story, but a close friend of mine plays the French horn. He stopped playing for a few years, telling everyone he was too busy to play, but he recently told me and a few other friends the true reason, which turns out to be that his grandmother used to sit in the bathroom. He had suffered from anal cancer or a related condition that made going to the restroom excruciatingly painful for years. Next to him while he practiced, and would strike him whenever he made a mistake. Eventually, he was unable to handle it any longer, and he stopped playing until his grandmother died. His mother is currently incarcerated for physically abusing him and his older sister. The abuse began accidentally one day when she was preparing dinner and mishandled a knife, cutting his sister's hand. She then started hitting her on purpose, and finally moved. I have another friend who has endured even more. We met less than a month ago, and she has already told me the first part of her life story. Her dad was abusive, so when she was 8 months old, her mom left, but she was unable to take her with her, so she was deported back to Europe. On top of that, his mom once hit his sister so hard with a hanger that had torn through her shirt. My friend attempted to protect his sister, but he was expelled from the house and moved in with his dad shortly after that. His mom was arrested. Didn't come back to America for a number of years. Her father always told her that her mother had left because she didn't want her. A few years later, her father married her first stepmother, who had 2 older sons. My friend's father had to leave to care for her grandfather, who had cancer. Her stepmother didn't like her, and her stepbrothers would frequently get her into trouble just to see her punished by their mother. The older stepbrother also began to humiliate her by giving her black eyes and harassing her. Her father was unaware of the abuse in front of the stepbrothers, but he divorced the stepmother for other reasons, moved in with a new girlfriend who seemed nice, and had a son. The new girlfriend and her son were not abusive like the previous family, but my friend shared a room with the son, and he used to harass her for years, chasing her around with a small torch as a prank. She continues to blame herself for everything that happened to her, even though none of it was her fault. Oh, and my brother is somewhat involved with. Story 44. My grandfather on my dad's side died of a massive heart attack at the young age of 40 when my dad was around 10 or 12 years old. Sometime after the funeral, my grandmother started dating a man named Mitch, who my dad and his siblings detested. I had heard random references to Mitch growing up, but as I grew older, I asked my mom about him because my dad doesn't often discuss his past, and she informed me that Mitch was a gigolo who eventually. My great-aunt loves to tell the story of how, after drinking, my dad chased Mitch through the house with a baseball bat, forcing him to hide under a bed. After a few years of marriage, Mitch had depleted her finances, causing them to file for bankruptcy 3 times, almost 4 times. It seems that he was extremely abusive to my dad and his siblings until my dad was about 17 or 18 years old. Eventually, my grandmother received an annulment and somehow managed to change back to her previous last name, enabling her to resume receiving military benefits from my late grandfather's story 45 on my father's side. My grandfather was a Vietnam veteran who was lost in action for a few weeks. When he returned, he became inebriated and slept around. My father and his brothers would frequently have to search the ditches near the local bar for their pasted-out drunk father. One night, my grandfather woke up from a nightmare and realized he was choking my grandma. Because of things like this, my dad and his father had a tense relationship. Given that a lot of his behavior was clearly PTSD, I'm not on either side of the family. My mom was unintentionally conceived out of wedlock, ruining my grandparents' lives in the 1950s. They were poor and unhappy with one another, and after a while, another baby was on the way. Since they were barely making ends meet, Grandma went to get an illegal abortion, but once she realized she couldn't follow through, she already had her skirt hitched up. I'm glad she didn't because my aunt is the sweetest, most sincere person. I am aware that there is a rumor that my maternal grandfather's father performed abortions in a bar's back room following the war, but I don't think it's true. I would like to ask my grandfather about it, but my mother has sworn me to secrecy. Story 46. I attended an all-girls private school called Wu Kilts, and there was a girl there who was very needy. If you were kind to her, she would latch onto you and be almost impossible to shake off. I got along well enough, but I kept my distance because of this. I noticed that, even as a day student, she never seemed eager to return home. She only did so when the school was closed, and she had to go to summer camp every year for Christmas. I didn't think much of it, just thought it was a little strange, but other girls, like the international students, didn't go home either. She was from the US, and this school was in Ontario. On weekends, boarding students would take buses to the local mall to shop, watch movies, etc., before being busted back. One day, she was caught shoplifting during one of these excursions and was expelled. Years went by, and I didn't give her much thought until I was talking to a friend's mother one day. She used to work at a local mental health facility, and although I'm sure it was a breach of confidentiality, she shared some details with me about why the girl rarely went home. Her family didn't want her when she was very young. I always felt that was unfair because if a day student like me had been caught shoplifting over the weekend, we wouldn't have been expelled at most, but our mall privileges would have been revoked. It's shocking what some parents can do. She was too young to be left in charge. Her toddler brother drowned after wandering onto the pool cover. The family blamed her for the accident and kept her away from them whenever possible. She had, understandably, seen a local psychologist to deal with her feelings of abandonment and guilt, but she was surprisingly well adjusted after being expelled. Her family then took her back to the US and had her committed.